Okay, and let's open up the VS Code again. Let's open up the file that we're working on so far. Let's fire this up, and I'll open up the JavaScript file, which is index.js. Okay, let's go live. So console, we have all of this ready now. So yesterday we were talking about these topics called restructuring and all of that, which were some of the new topics which are introduced later on in JavaScript. All right. So now today we're going to talk about some important methods in objects. Like till now we spoke about methods related to arrays and all that, but now we're going to talk about objects in specific. Okay. So first, let's talk about this. The feature called shorthand properties. Okay. To put it very simply, let's say that I have a property called ID. I mean, a variable called ID where the value is 1. And I want to create an object, user object, where the value of ID will basically be whatever the value is here, which is this. Okay. Now, what does this mean? This basically means that I have an object here which has a property called ID, and the value of user.id is this value called 1. Basically, I'm just assigning the value of this variable to this property, which means when I do this, when I do console.log of user.id, I get back the result of 1, which is expected. Let's say there's one more property called city. And if I add this city property, which must equal this value again, which means I can just put this value of city. Okay, again, what this means is if I just do user.city here, I get back Hyderabad. Okay. All I'm doing here is I'm saying I just want to create one object where the ID property is basically this value, which means this ID. And the city property will refer to this value. Now, writing in case the ID and the value here is the same thing, if the names are the same here, then we can just get rid of this thing like this. We can remove this also. Okay. Basically, what this means is there is a value, there is a variable with the same name of ID, which is a value of this property. Basically, this means this and this are exactly the same, and we can do this only when the property and the variable that refers to the value of the property are both the same, which means this and this are the same again. Okay. So if in case you're doing ID called ID and city called city, you can just get rid of this thing and this thing and just use the ID and city directly like this. Okay. Now again, I'll just give one more example. Let's say I create a variable called reviews, which sort of 5, 4.5, 5.0, 3.44, and maybe 2.8, 3.5, and 4.0, and 3.5. So basically I have an array of all the numbers here. Now I want to get the maximum of this array. Let's do math.max of the spread operator and then reviews. We spoke about what this operator does. It basically takes out all the values from within this array and it spreads it out inside this function call. And similar way, if I want to get the minimum of this, I can just do math.min and spread operator and then reviews. Okay. Next thing, if I want to get the sum of all the elements with a sum of all the numbers within this array, I can just use the reviews.reduce. I get the sum and the number, and I just do sum plus number. This gives me like the sum. We spoke about reduce yesterday. Let's say if we want to get the average of the numbers. I can just do sum by reviews.length. Okay, right now I have all of these properties. Now what I want to do is I want to create an object called stats, where the property of min will basically equal this thing, which is min, and the property of max will equal this thing, which is max. A property called average will be average, and a property called sum will be sum. Now, because we have the property name and the variable which holds the value of this property are the same things, I can just get rid of all of these things. So I can just do, one second, I can just do this like this. Okay, whatever I wrote before this and this, both are exactly the same. Just that this is a shorter way of writing the properties, especially if the name of the property and the variable that holds the value of the property both are same. In that case, we can just use the shorthand properties. Okay, that is the new feature that we have learned. Right. Now we're going to talk about one more very important thing. By the way, guys, all of these features are very important because you'll be using them a lot in React. Okay. Next is this thing called computed properties. Computed properties. Now let's say I have a variable called property, which is basically ID. Okay, this is a property called ID. Now I create a user object, and let's say I want an ID here with 1. Okay. Now, what if you want this to be dynamic? Like instead of giving a static value here, I want to give a dynamic value. I basically want to say okay, whatever the value of property is, I want that to be the property here. Which means let's say कि अगर ये ID है तो ये ID होगा. But let's say if this is actually maybe location, this should be location. And let's say if this is name, this will be name. Basically, what I want to do is I want this property to have the name of this thing. Whatever the property ka value here, जो भी इसका value है, that will be the key inside this object. And for that, I can just do this. By doing this, what I'm trying to say is whatever is the value of this property variable, that will be the key here. Which means if we know that the property actually holds the value of name, which means this user object will now have name as the property here, and value will be 1. Let's just see the console.log of user. We get name 1. Now, if we change this to, let's say, location, we get location 1. If we change this to ID, we get ID 1. Basically, like when you want to drive the name of your keys based on some other variable, then we can use the computed properties feature here. What I'm trying to say here is, by giving the square brackets here, you're basically saying whatever is the value of this property variable, that will be the key inside this property. One more example. Let's say if the user is Jules, some weird name, but let's say user roles will be an object where if I say user and admin. Now, what does this mean, guys? Basically, this means that this user is pointing to this property, this variable, and hence user roles will be an object with Jules as the key and admin as the value. Like, let's say if I just do a console.log of user roles, I get Jules as the key and admin as the value. This is called computed properties. Basically, you're saying key, whatever variable you provide inside the curly, inside the square brackets here, that variable will point to this value, and this value will become the key here. That becomes the key. Okay. That was about computer prop. Any questions here?
सर एक बार फिर से इसको रिपीट करना सर, अगर हम जोल लिखते हैं जोल तो उसके आगे
I'll tell you again. हाँ, तो okay, first of all, let's say कि यूजर प्रॉपर्टी है और से ID1, ठीक है, लेकिन there is one more variable called user key, which is ID. I want this thing, whatever the key name here is, I want that to be derived by this variable. मतलब user key का variable में जो भी value मैंने दिया है, that should become the key here.
Sir, can I see the output now?
Right now there will be nothing. Right now nothing will change because user will just be this object. But if I change this to user key here, then we see ID1, because see what you're saying here is inside the square bracket. What is the variable? User key. Like in user key, what is it pointing to? Point to ID. It means this ID will become the key here. If I change location, let's say, then we get location 1, because see difference between this and let's say const another user. If I just say user key is equal to 1, there is a big difference between this and this. Both are not the same, because here what I'm saying here is the another user, this object has a property called user key. The property का नाम ही user key है, which means I can actually do console.log of another user of I can do this, okay, because user key is the name of the key inside this property here. लेकिन यहाँ पर what I'm saying is this object does not contain a key called does not contain a property called user key. It contains a property called location, because you have given a square brackets here, and whatever the value of this variable is, that will become the key here.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
No problem. So that was about computer properties. Let's move on to the next topic, which is about methods. Now, so far we've discussed a lot about methods. We've used the slice method, map method, filter method, all of those things. But what exactly are methods? So let's say I create an object called math, and I'm going to add a property called multiply. Now we have done this before. See, when you create a property within an object, the property can have any value. It can have a number, it can have a string, it can be a Boolean value, or it can be null, it can be undefined, whatever you want basically, but it can also be a function. And this function will receive two parameters called x and y, and you return x into y. Now let's see what's happening here is, see, I've created a property called multiply inside this object, where this multiply property is just pointing to a function called this one, which means this time I can actually access this multiply property just like by doing math.multiply, but this will actually be a function, because this multiply is a function which you can call, and you can even pass the two parameters here, x and y. So I'm going to pass 10 and 19 like this, and this time if I just do a console.log of math.multiply of 10, 19, I get back 190 here. Now this is actually what we call as a method. Whenever you define a function inside a property of an object, that function becomes a method of that object. But if you create a simple function, let's say like this function is not called a method. This function is just called as a function, that's it, nothing else. But when you define a function inside an object, that function becomes a method. Okay, which means this is how we call a method here. Math.multiply, you pass the two arguments which you're providing here, and it returns to x into y, and hence this is the return value which we are logging here is 190. We can also add more methods as well. Let's add one more method called divide. This will also be a function. It takes x comma y and it returns to x by y. One more method would be square. It would be a function and x, and we just return square like this. Which means you can basically you can change this to, let's say, math.divide, and you pass in the parameter values. We get back the correct answer here. And one more way, we can do the square of, let's say, 5. We get 25. And each of these is, even though they are functions, they are specifically called methods in this case because we are adding them inside an object like this. Whenever you add the functions inside an object, that becomes a method. Okay. Is this clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, last thing we'll discuss about the methods is we can actually write the methods as arrow functions also. Let's convert this into let's convert this thing into an arrow function. So we have to just remove the function keyword and just make it like this. That's it. This is an arrow function. But as you know, when you within the arrow function body, if all we are doing is just returning something, we can get rid of the return keyword also like this and get rid of this also. This is the simplest form of arrow functions. What we're doing here is this is a function which accepts 2 parameters and it just returns you x into y. This just means returning because we do not have any curly braces, nor do we have the return keyword. This just means that we're returning out of this function by returning x into y. So let's convert the same function into an arrow function. So we'll just remove this thing and remove this, remove return keyword and remove all of this. That's it. Let's convert this also into an arrow function like this and like this. Okay. This is how you can convert them, all of them, into an arrow function. But there's one more way. Let's write a normal function now. Let's say we'll just add. And add will be a function again which receives a couple of parameters, and you return x plus y. Now, one more way of writing the shorthand for functions is by removing this colon and removing the function keyword. This is one more way of writing the functions or methods inside an object. This basically means we have a property called add, which is nothing but a method, a function here. This and all of these are exactly the same, no difference at all. Okay, just the syntax is different. This is an arrow function and this is a non-arrow function.
Sir, print the value of add.
Of add, okay. Let's do a console.log of math.add 10 and 5. We get 50. See, let me tell you something. This and this are absolutely the same. Function x comma y and return x plus y. Both are absolutely the same. There's no difference between this and this at all. Okay. Also, one more thing is, see, when you add 2 properties with the same name, whatever occurs at the very end, that will override everything above it. Like for example, let's remove all of this. Now remove all of this also. Let's say I have A is 10, I have B is 20. Second, I write A is 30. Now we have two properties with the same name. First of all, JavaScript will allow us to do it. Okay, JavaScript कोई error नहीं देगा. But the thing is, whenever you do a console.log of math.a, it will always be whatever the latest value is. So let's just do a console.log of math.a. We get back 30 because that is the last you wrote here. Let's add one more A 40 and A will be maybe 100. We get back 100. Whatever you put at the very end, that will be the actual value of math.a. Again, error to nahi dega, but just remember that if you are adding the same property multiple times, whatever you add at the very end, that will be taken up. Okay, so I hope that is also clear.
Yes, sir.
So I'll just 1 second. I have to send myself some notes before we stop. So our next topic is JavaScript DOM. So see, so far what we have done is we've just discussed JavaScript as a programming language. Okay, so JavaScript, what is it? How do you add numbers? How do you do mathematical operations? How do you perform operations on strings, objects, arrays? We have learned about all of these things. But so far we have learned that in isolation. इसका मतलब है कि we have not learned about how to mix JavaScript with HTML and CSS. अभी तक हमने जो भी सीखा है, we have learned only about JavaScript. But we have to learn how we can use JavaScript to actually how we can use JavaScript to change the stuff on the browser, on the website. Like let's say we have a website. उस website को अगर हमको interactive बनाना है, then we have to include JavaScript also. And we have to actually use JavaScript to basically change the elements or modify the elements or select the elements on the web page. Okay, that is what we're going to learn now. So it is nothing but DOM. So basically, we're going to learn about how to interact with HTML and CSS with JavaScript. How does JavaScript interact with HTML and CSS? That is the topic now. And what you're going to learn about is this thing called the topic we're going to learn about is DOM. So DOM is a very, very important thing. Like React में भी बहुत use होगा. So basically, see, DOM, it stands for Document Object Model. Document. DOM basically stands for Document Object Model. What it means is, see, at the very core of it, it's nothing but it's a bunch of JavaScript objects that represent a web page. Like whatever web page you take, let's take this web page, or let's take this web page. Okay, DOM is nothing but it's a collection of different JavaScript objects which represent this website or whatever website you're working with. Like let's say if we have a H1, right? Let's say we add a H1 element to our web page, then JavaScript, we will have a JavaScript object which represents that H1, and we can change. Browser will update to show those changes. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, let's say we have a website here, and this website, we have created a H1. हमने HTML में हमने, so we just wrote a H1 here. So what I'm saying is, let's say that within a HTML page, we have written a h1 like this. Second. तो हमने हमारा HTML फाइल में ये लिखा है, एंड वेब ब्राउजर में क्या होगा? We will see a h1 saying hello world like this. ये एक h1 होगा. Okay. Now what happened is there is this thing called DOM. DOM बोल के every browser will have this thing called DOM, nothing but document object model. Now this will have a corresponding object that represents this h1, which means there will basically be an object where this object will contain all the information about this h1 element. Using JavaScript, what we do is we make some changes inside this object, which will ultimately get reflected on the web page. Because remember, the h1, whatever we have a corresponding object for that. And when we change the values within that object, like let's say we change the style to maybe color will change to red maybe. Okay. When we change the color to red of this h1 object, that will represent, that will update the changes of h1 on the web page as well. That's how DOM works. Basically, it's a medium for us to access the web page from JavaScript. Like if you want an entry point to the elements which are there in the HTML page, from JavaScript, we can do that using DOM. Basically, DOM is like a door for us, okay, where we can actually enter the world of HTML. One second. This will basically let us, JavaScript will basically use DOM. Okay. And DOM will basically make the changes on the web page for us, which means JavaScript, for it to interact with the web page and make changes there, we have to make use of this concept called DOM. One second, guys. Yeah, so okay, one example of how we can use JavaScript to make changes to the web page. Let's say we go to google.com and you search for anything. Let's search for, let's say, Into the Spider-Verse, which is my favorite movie. So here, if you see, we will actually get this thing called accordion. And we have these people also asked. Now, when I click on this, we see that this has expanded. When I click on it again, it collapses. Then I click on this, expands, collapse, expand, collapse. Now, all of this functionality, which is there, that's happening because of JavaScript. What JavaScript is doing is basically JavaScript is targeting this element, and it's saying that whenever you click on this element, I will make some changes to the DOM, which will update the web page to expand this. When I click on this again, JavaScript will make sure that that element again collapses and DOM will update, and that will make the changes appear on the website again. That's how DOM actually works. That is DOM. So one more example is, let's go to this thing called Trello. Not sure if I'll be able to access it now. No, I don't have access to it. But basically, okay, let's say we go to Netflix. Netflix, whatever this carousel that we have, right? Like, we have all of these items here. And when I click on this button, it brings me up more icons. Now, this is also controlled by JavaScript. Okay, so JavaScript basically lets us change the contents, the layout, the styling of whatever you want on the web page. Guys, bottom line is, DOM is a concept that exists in every browser, where basically you have a bunch of objects that represent every element on the web page. And using JavaScript, you modify these objects. Once you modify these objects, they will update the actual UI. Okay. Now let's talk about this thing called a document object. There is an object called document in a browser. So every single time, if you go to a console here, and if you just type out the word called document, and if you hit enter, you see that there is something called document. When I open this, I'll see bunch. I mean, we actually have to do console.dir of document. When I expand this, I get back a bunch of properties, which means there is an object called document which has multiple properties here, many properties here. Let's talk about what this document object actually is. The way DOM works is when a browser loads the web page, part of the loading process involves taking the HTML and CSS and creating a whole bunch of JavaScript objects based on these elements and the styles. Let's say, for example, this is our HTML page, and we'll write the code like, we have a body, and you have h1. So let me write this code in VS Code. It will be easier. I'll copy and paste it here. So let's say inside the body, we have one h1 hello, and we have UL inside which I have two LIs. And the first LI will basically be water plants, and second one will be get some sleep. So we have this inside our document right now. When I paste this here, this is what the HTML page will look like. But what will happen is the browser will take browser isko leke, it will convert this into a DOM structure. The way the DOM looks is, first of all, it constructs an object called document. Document बोल के एक बड़ा सा object रहेगा, which we just saw. This will be the topmost element of the DOM. Next, we'll have this thing called body. Now, we have body here, so we'll have to add body like this. Body के अंदर we have one h1 and one UL. So let's create those both. So we have h1 here, and we also have a UL here. Now this UL instead, again, it contains two LI elements. So I'll create two LI elements here. This one LI and this one LI. I'll say LI and LI. Now this is basically what the browser does. Browser will take in whatever HTML page you give, and it converts that into a document object model, which is DOM. DOM is nothing but it basically has one specific object for every element of the web page. So document object always exists, but apart from that, whatever else elements you have, DOM will construct the objects for every single thing, which means the body ka element jo hai, uska ek object bana jayega, and then you have h1, so uska ek object bana jayega, then you have UL, that also will have an object again, and LI elements also will have an object. Basically, every element on the web page will have a corresponding object in DOM. So every single element, including the body, gets its own JavaScript object, and those objects all have certain properties. Like, they might have the type of elements they represent. Like, is it an LI? Is it an image or whatever? But then some of the elements have more specialized things. Like, let's say if you have an image element, they might have like some additional properties like the source property. Or if you have an anchor element, you might have an additional property called the href attribute. Okay. Also, if you look at these things, you can see that this document is the parent of all of these things, and body is the parent for both H1 UL. UL is the parent for LI, both of these elements, which means there is a relationship between all of these elements, right? The relationship is this body is the parent of these both, and H1 and UL are siblings, and Li are siblings, and UL is the parent of these both, and H1 is the child of body. So basically, in DOM, there's always a relationship between all the elements here. Okay, the relationships are like between the parent and siblings and all of that. Now, what we have here is a very simple example of this small code.
Sir,
But imagine if,
sir, what is the relation between body and Li?
the body is still the grandparent of Li.
Okay, sir.
Just imagine that this is your grandfather, and this is your father, and this is you and your sister.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, so that's how it works basically. Now, what we'll do is, like I said, so at the very top, though, at the very top, there is a very special element or special object called the document. Okay. By the way, so if you actually, like I said, right, see, if you do this console.log of document, when you expand this, it shows this, but this is actually not the correct one. You have to just do console.dir. Okay, console.dir ka matlab hai console.directory. When you hit enter, this one will give you an object. This one, basically, document is the most top level object which has multiple properties inside them, and this is how it looks. Now, if you can, let's look at some of the important things here. If you go down, you might see a property called URL, which is pretty helpful. There should be a property. Okay, actually, the document, if you look at this, it tells you what is the document element. Like basically, so document is the property. Document is an object, which basically tells you like what, it represents the entire HTML page. So everything that you need to do to work with DOM, you can actually use document. Document is this topmost object which contains a lot of properties and methods that you can use in order to manipulate the DOM itself. This entire thing is DOM. The way you manipulate or the way you communicate with the DOM would be one of the ways would be to use document object. Okay. Now what we'll do is first of all, one second. I need to have a folder called DOM intro. It looks like I don't have it. Okay, I have this folder here. Let me open this up in VS Code. So I'm going to open a new folder called DOM intro, which already has some index for HTML. So it already has some HTML code here. Okay, so let's just run this and see how it looks first of all. Live server. So you open the web page, and this is how the folder looks, by the way. I mean, the page looks, by the way. So we basically have a H1 here, which is this H1, and then we have an image. It is this image, and we have a bunch of we have a lot of contents here. Okay, so we're going to work on this document right now. Okay, we're going to work on this document. Now, first of all, what we need to do is The document object, like I told you, contains a bunch of methods, and some of them are really, really important. So one of the first things we're going to do, today is we're going to start talking about the methods that help us to select the elements on the web page. What I'm trying to say is, let's say we have these elements on the web page. Okay, we need to select them. Like, how do we select the elements? Before you start making changes to the elements on the web page, first thing is to select them, right? After you select the element, okay, you make the changes to the element, and then you'll see the UI to be updated. Okay, so first we're going to start talking about selecting the elements. Okay, now let me repeat what I'm saying. I'm saying that I have this HTML page which has multiple elements, and some of the elements, if you can see in HTML page, are you have the image element, you have span, you have paragraph, you have H1, you have a lot of elements on the page here. Before I start updating the UI, before I start modifying the DOM, I need to first of all select the elements which are on the DOM. Okay, so we're going to start off with a very simple very simple method, that is the document dot get element by ID. First of all, I told you that, see, document is an object, okay, which is a top level object, which is this object. Now, on the document object, there can be multiple methods, and these methods can be used for different purposes. Now, the methods that I'm going to talk about will help us to select the elements. Okay. For example, here, let's give an ID of, let's say we have this. Let's select an ID here. Let's select. We have an ID called TOC. Okay, let's say I want to select. I want to get the element by ID of TOC. TOC. When I hit enter, it gives me back this element itself. See, if I expand this, I get back this. But again, if I just do a console.dir, stop this one. I get back this element. If I expand this, I get back an object again. This object is nothing but DOM में जब DOM बनाया गया था, and when the browser came across this element, the browser converted this element into an object, and that is nothing but this object. And like I told you, DOM is nothing but, for every element on the web page, you will have a corresponding object in the DOM. That is nothing but the DOM itself. So DOM may, whatever elements you have on the web page, there will be corresponding objects for that on the DOM. Okay, now that is what we're seeing here. Now, the first element I spoke about is get element by ID, where you pass in the ID of the element that you want to grab. Okay, like what I want to select this element. I want to return this element from the DOM, and this element has an ID of TOC, and hence I give it an ID of TOC, which will return to me this element. But when you expand this, it only shows you this element in the HTML form. But if we want to see the element in the form of an object, then we do console.dir. And this time we get back the object itself. And this object is nothing but the object representation of this element. Let's take one more example. Let's say, let's say I want to select this H2 with the ID of MWTOC heading. Okay, अगर मुझे इसको select करना है, then I can just do document dot get element by ID, and I give it an ID of this. When I give it an ID of this, all I'm saying is I need to select the element which has an ID of this. Like पूरे page में, whichever element has the ID of this, I want to select it. And it gives me back this h2, but if I want to get back the actual object of this, I have to just do console.dir. And I'll just copy and paste this. And when I do this, it'll give me back the object of the element itself. Now, this is the object of the h2 element, which has this ID. That is by using document.getElementById. by ID. Okay, let's look at some of the important properties inside this one. Like if you see here, if so it actually has this thing called class list, which maintains all the list of class names that the element has. And if you see here, this is ID. What is the ID of the element? We're getting it here. And if you go further down, you get this thing called tag name. Tag name. The tag name is h2. We know that we try to select this element. अभी इस element का जो object आया है, that is this object. And one of the properties on this object is this thing called tag name. And tag name is h2. And the text content, इसका मतलब है what is there inside the h2. We have this word called contents, and that exists inside this thing. Okay. To refresh, basically, whenever you write a HTML document inside your VS Code or whatever, once the browser will take it inside, the browser will convert that into a document object model, a DOM. And when we have the DOM, the entire web page will be converted into multiple objects, where every element has a corresponding object. Now, body has a corresponding object, and h1 has a corresponding object. UL also has an object, and both the elements also they have an object. Basically, every element on this DOM is nothing but an object again. Because they're objects, JavaScript can interact with it. Okay. And this document is a special type of an object at the very top level, where basically document contains multiple methods on top of it. One of them includes this get element by ID also. And this get element by ID will take in the ID name, and it returns to you the actual element itself. But if you do console.dir of the same thing, that will return to you the object. Okay, the object, the h2 element object is this. Later on, we'll see how to manipulate, but for now, all we're learning is how to select the elements. Okay, that is what you see here. So any questions so far, guys?
Yes, sir. Sir, can you tell me what is a prototypical inheritance?
We have not come till there yet. That will come later.
Okay, sir.
वो दूसरा टॉपिक है, separate topic है वो. We'll talk about that after DOM.
Sir, thank you, sir.
Yeah. No problem. Okay, now I know that this DOM can be a very challenging to understand. So what I would suggest you to do today, guys, is okay. Actually, I'll explain one more method, and then we'll stop the class, and then I'll tell you what to do, how to practice it at your own on your own tomorrow and day after. Okay. So the next important method on the document is this thing called document dot get elements by tag name. What this takes in is, let's say I want to get back all the elements which have a tag of img, which is the image tag, which means जितने भी images है website पे, I basically want a list of all those elements. मुझे list चाहिए with all the image elements. For that, I can use this thing, and I can just pass an img here. Now this will return to you something called an HTML collection. This looks like an array to you if you see. It looks like an array. And if you expand this, you get back multiple items of the array, where you have multiple image options, items here. So if we go back here, the first image that we see is we see this image first, which has an ID of banner that we get back here. And next, if you go down, we see one more image, which is with a class of square that we see here. And again, we see two other images with class of square, which are these both. Basically, this method will give you back a list of all the elements which have this tag name. Let's say I want to get back all the H1s. I get back only one element. If I want to get back all the H2s, okay, there are these many elements. There are two elements basically. One with H2 and this also H2. Basically, this will return to you a list of all the elements which have this tag name. Let's see what else we have. We have a paragraph. Let's search a paragraph now. Let's do P. This will again give you back all the paragraph elements which are there on the HTML page right now. Okay. Basically, this might look like an array, but it's not actually an array. But you still can use, you can use some properties. For example, let's say I get back list of images. List of images. I'll do document dot get elements. By tag name, I give back the img here. Okay, now what happens is, see, I have list of images which represents this HTML collection, which looks like an array, but it's not an array. But I can still get back the length if I want. Length is 4, which means there are 4 images within this list of images list, right? And you can even loop over this also if you want. Like, let's do this. So I will go inside my thing. I'll be like, select the images. And I'll be like const all images will basically be document dot get elements by tag name ving. Okay, now I can actually loop over this. I can say for const image of all images, and I'll just do console.dir of image. So if you see, I'll just refresh the page. Just ignore this thing, but we basically have 4 images right now. Okay, so let's say if I want to change the source of all the images, so right now there is one chicken here, and we have other kinds of chickens here, right? So let's say if I want to change the source of all of them. Let's search for Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse. Let's select an image. It's not a JPEG. Let me select the JPEG. This is the image. Now I'm going to copy this. I'm going to say he changed the image source to this. Now when we go back to our page, we see that all of the images have now been changed to this one. This is this image. See, this is how I actually manipulated the DOM. Now there are other ways you can change the source, but to just give an example how we can use DOM to change the stuff on the web page, this is one example. So I basically what I did, is, first of all, I selected all the images from the website by using this thing. This gives us back an array-like structure, which we can loop over. And when I'm looping over the structure, I'm changing the IMG ka source to this one. Basically, जो भी image element आया था, उन सारे image element के source को मैंने यहाँ change कर दिया है. That's why we see the same image everywhere now. Okay, this is how it basically works. Now we'll stop the session here because I know it's too much to take. So what I want you guys to do is just first we'll just go ahead and create a simple HTML website. Okay, and then add many different kinds of elements to it, like h1, h2, h3, anchor tag, link tag, UL, all of those. Just add all of those things. And we've discussed about the documents. So just use document.getElementById. And also use document.getElements by tag. Just use these both and try to select multiple elements. And just expand those expand the objects and see how they behave. For example, one of the example I can give you is, let's say we have this. I want to select the H2. Let's say I want to select the H2, which is this one. So I'll add this ID, and I'll be like console.dir of document.getElementById, and I pass this ID here. What I get back is this object which has multiple properties. Okay, just do the same thing in your own example and expand the object and see what all properties are there and how we can change them. But just to go through it yourself for sure, okay? And you'll get an understanding of how DOM behaves and all of that. Once that is done, we'll again, we'll continue the class on Sunday morning. But till then, please go through whatever we spoke about today and the previous classes. Go through all the array methods, the object methods, all the features we spoke about. Go through everything we spoke about the last 2-3 weeks, and then we'll continue the class on Sunday. But for now, we'll stop the class. But do you guys have any questions for me?
No, sir.
Okay, guys, I'll see you on Sunday then.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.